Hello again. 20 years ago, people in Britain who changed sex were as rare as rocking horse shit, to use a vulgar colloquialism. Most of us did not encounter such a person or even read about them in the newspapers from one year to the next, let alone see them on television. The only place where such individuals used to turn up occasionally until a few years ago was in the Sunday papers. The News of the World used to be the place if you wanted to read about people that had sex change operations. Those were the days when we all knew that there were homosexuals, both male and female, and most of us could hardly care less. There was a gay scene for those who wanted it, and it didn't really affect anybody else. Girls who didn't fancy boys and were perhaps a little masculine often became lesbians, or they grew out of it, became ordinary women, and effeminate boys sometimes became homosexuals as adults. Then things began to change. Girls who are not typically female today in their identity or interests are under pressure to avoid becoming lesbians and instead to take hormones and consider top surgery, that is to say, having a double mastectomy. Boys who are a bit feminine are in the same way guided towards the belief that they are really girls and not homosexuals. This accounts for the growth of the so-called trans community and the fact that transphobia is such a big thing now. Almost all those who would a few years ago have been simply a certain type of homosexual are now encouraged to act instead as though they belong to the opposite sex. I used to knock around with quite a few lesbians 35 years ago and go to various events at lesbian venues such as the Drill Hall, First Out and so on. Almost all these places have closed down now because it is no longer possible for lesbians to meet in places where there are just other lesbians. In the name of trans inclusion, there are no longer any lesbian clubs, as in places where just women who are lesbians can hang out with each other. Just women, that is. They would be denounced as TERFs if they did so. That is to say, trans exclusionary feminists. The lesbian scene has been driven underground. All this ties in with a huge industry in helping people to change sex. This is run by surgeons, therapists and psychiatrists, and it's really big business. Women are having their breasts removed, while men are having them added. Men are paying to have facial hair removed by electrolysis, while women are paying for courses of hormones which will enable them to grow facial hair. These things have been available for the last half century or so, of course. There were sex change operations and so on back in the 1960s and 1970s. It's just that there was hardly any demand for it in those days. Now there is a flood of demands for changing sex, and it has coincided with a dramatic decline in exclusively gay places. Everything is combined with transsexuals these days. This is why the old rainbow flag was altered to recognise the enormous number of trans people who are around these days. The overall effect has been to reduce the number of homosexuals and relabel many of them as belonging really to the opposite sex. In this way, homosexual women are designated as being men, and by amputating their breasts and giving them hormones, they are transformed into an approximation of that role. The same is being done with male homosexuals who take hormones and have themselves castrated. It surely cannot have escaped anybody's notice that an awful lot of the so-called trans women that we see resemble old-time drag queens. This was always a bit of a thing on the gay scene, or particular parts of the gay scene, although nobody was under any illusion in those days that such men wearing women's clothing really were women. That is a new twist to things. If Britain is very keen on sex change operations, there is another country which is even more enthusiastic about the whole idea, and it is perhaps one that few of us would suspect. Iran actually leads the world in sex change surgery. There, I don't suppose many people watching this were aware of that. The reason is very simple. The Iranians cannot stand homosexuals, especially men, and they'll take any steps they can to do away with what they regard as an unnatural and immoral practice. Islam absolutely forbids male homosexuality explicitly, and in Iran it carries the death penalty. Men are regularly hanged for engaging in homosexual sex. Sex changes, though, or sex reassignment surgery, are another matter entirely. Ayatollah Khomeini, who older viewers will remember, was the autocratic theological leader of Iran after the 1979 revolution. He accepted that it was possible for a man to be born with the spirit of a woman, and vice versa, and his views are now the orthodox opinion in clerical circles in Iran. Male homosexuals there are urged to undergo surgery and live as women. If they do so, then there's no objection to their having sex with other men, because according to the tenets of Shia Islam as it's accepted in Iran, a man who has had a sex change operation is actually a woman. The result of this trend is to put male homosexuals in the country under tremendous pressure to have themselves castrated and wear women's clothes. The problem is, of course, that like most men, male homosexuals anywhere, including Iran, have no desire at all to lose their penis. It is as important to homosexual men as it is to heterosexuals. Nevertheless, when the alternative is being publicly hanged, many are persuaded that being castrated might be the lesser of two evils, and so more sex change operations are carried out in Iran than in Britain each year. Iran is, by the way, the only Muslim country where sex change operations, or gender affirmation, or sex reassignment, or whatever you wish to call it, are accepted. Yet one more reason why Arab countries loathe Iran. In Iran, encouragement of homosexuals to identify as being trans is done under threat of death, and the aim is ultimately to rid the country of homosexuality. In Britain, homosexuals are not under the threat of public execution as they are in Iran, but there is certainly great pressure on them to identify as belonging to the opposite sex rather than be homosexuals. The end result is just the same as Iran. That is to say, fewer homosexuals and more men who say that they are women and women who claim to be men. It is curious that two such different nations should both get caught up in this business, and that the end result in both should be so eerily similar.